Prophets. Prophecy has little to do with predictions for the future, but usually is a warning of God's displeasure over the sins of God's people. And God's people seldom welcome such warnings or the prophets who deliver them. The Old Testament is full of prophets and their difficult role with Israel. Moses was a kind of prophet. Then there was Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and others. Martin Luther, who led the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, can be considered a prophet. Abraham Lincoln developed into the most important prophet in American history. His summons to justice for Americans in the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address will always stand as magnificent experiences of the voice of God for Americans back then, today, and forever. 7 years ago, a new nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In an earlier address, Lincoln called us to embrace the United States as the last best hope of earth. What an astounding, profound pronouncement. Not Israel, not the church, but our United States, the last best hope of earth. On March 4th, 1865, as crowds gathered to hear Lincoln's second inaugural address, they expected a terrific time of triumph, a proud celebration of the victory of North over South and the righteousness of the Union crusade. Because though the war was not yet over, Union hope for victory seemed certain. They did not get the celebration they expected. Instead, Lincoln acknowledged and admitted the North's role as well as the South in profiting from and sustaining slavery over the years. And he said in part, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the slaveholders, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, and charity for all, let us do all which may achieve a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. The crowd that day and the people were not particularly pleased with that speech. At the time, they were disappointed. They wanted something different. As the years passed, however, Lincoln's address that day has become one of America's truly great events. 40 days later, on Good Friday, Abraham Lincoln suffered the fate of many true prophets when he was murdered at Ford's Theater in Washington. Today is Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday, a modern American prophet who was martyred in 1968, giving his life to finally fulfill Lincoln's hope, Lincoln's virtual prayer, that the dead of Gettysburg had not died in vain. For up until King's crusade, blacks dared not to try to even register to vote in too many places in our and their country, so that the promise of Gettysburg remained unfulfilled. At this point, I pause within this message. We'll have a kind of intermission to recognize a practical truth. Our denomination, the United Church of Christ, along with many other churches, as well as many, many civic and political institutions, urge all of us today to renew our efforts to more fully realize the dreams of Scripture, of Lincoln, and of King. We are called upon to do more, give more, sacrifice more. I understand that, and I want to do my part. But I also realize that most of our congregations are themselves struggling to survive. A majority of our members are along in years or elderly. They are dealing with the very real challenges of aging, with the losses it brings. And so this gives me pause when I hear spiritual leaders sound the trumpet, summoning all of us to the battle for justice and righteousness. The truth is that we are limited in what we can do, what we can contribute in money, energy, and time. And I think we need to feel that our limitations are understood and appreciated by leadership. That said, we are the church, and that must mean something. The justice of Jesus calls us to do what we can to remain responsible to truth and compassion in ways others do not feel necessary for themselves. End of pause. End of intermission. I believe it is important for us to truly realize just how vicious and cruel the racism was in parts of our nation, how deep and severe the racial hatred was that existed then before King's successful crusade. During the first half of the 20th century, lynchings were all too common in the South and some in the Midwest. These public murders of black men and some women were not committed in private, secluded areas. They were done in town squares and commons, often within sight of a church steeple or a courthouse. Some of the victims hanging from a tree or lamppost were set on fire while still alive. All of that should make an impact on us. I think what follows is even more significant. The railroads of the time put on extra trains to accommodate the hundreds of out-of-towners who wanted to come and enjoy the spectacle. Law enforcement made no effort to stop what they were well aware of. In many communities where a lynching was set for a weekday, school schedules were altered, starting later or letting out earlier, so that the kids could attend these lynchings, usually with their parents. I have a book which contains a large number of photos of the victims during and after the ordeal. These photos were made into picture postcards that spectators would purchase and send to friends and relatives who were not able to attend. There's a tremendous message there. About 3,500 black people were lynched in the United States between 1882 and as late as 1968. Congress repeatedly refused to make lynching a federal hate crime until 2 years ago. It is necessary to face up to just who we were as a nation before Martin Luther King's journey of justice. And that awareness will allow us to know and celebrate just how very far we have come since those truly awful days. There is much to be grateful for, and I was made very aware of it by several visits to the home of my youngest son. He has lived in Charleston, South Carolina for some years now, and I have on occasion with my wife visited him there. South Carolina had historically been one of our nation's most racist states. It was the first state to secede from the Union. The Civil War started there with the attack on Fort Sumter. Much later, South Carolina was the home of Strom Thurmond, who as governor led a revolt from the Democratic Party over civil rights and racial segregation. He ran for president as a segregationist candidate in 1948 and carried his home state and 3 other southern states. But a visit to today's South Carolina is inspiring for anyone who can remember when. 20 years ago, Annalisa and I visited our granddaughter's elementary school in a suburb of Charleston. We found black children and white children learning, sitting side by side. We saw blacks and white staff working together. When shopping, the stores, staff, and help are fully integrated, and the aisles are full of black and white customers shopping together. Go to a sporting event, and the stands are populated by blacks and whites, sitting side by side. If you're lucky enough to get a football ticket for either the University of South Carolina or Clemson, you'll find fans passionately cheering for their black stars, as well as for their white ones. They don't care who scores the touchdowns, as long as their team wins. Most impressive of all, I think, virtually nobody thinks anything of them. If they're young enough, they have known nothing else. And racial equality is largely taken for granted. They do not remember, as many of us do, when the South's slogan was a one-word battle cry: never. They don't remember when too many Americans were willing to kill to keep the races segregated. Martin Luther King was the nation's prophet. He and others were willing to die for their vision of justice and freedom for all. Their language and literature is the same Bible we have in our own pews. We are called to be worthy of it and of them. Amos called for justice to flow like a stream and righteousness to run like a river. It can, and at times in our lifetime it did. King led people to have faith that we shall overcome. We did. They have passed from the scene and have passed the torch to you and me. In their memory, let us hold it high.